Just to say this is on, isn't it? That's great. Okay, just to say thank you very much to the organisers for the invitation. I feel very excited to be here. I find today very stimulating, and it's been nice to make some new friends who obviously share the same intellectual interests as well. I will give my presentation in English. I'm sorry my French is not particularly good, although just for kind of fact-checking, I am Scottish, and so I make no apologies for that. So the topic I'm presenting on is based on a paper that I wrote with some colleagues last year, and that's on international legal responses for protecting fishers' fundamental rights impacted by a changing ocean. Now, that's available in a special issue in the International Journal of Marine and Coastal Law that my colleague Elisa Morgera and I co-edited. If you haven't had a chance to take a look at that, I suggest you do. There's a range of different inputs there that I think might be interesting for your own work as well. So just to shamelessly plug that before we get into today's discussion. So sorry, I forgot this. I'm just going to do this quickly. There we go. So I think just from the outset, maybe to go back a little bit and I'd like to open my presentations with a kind of reminder that, you know, the ocean itself is this integrated physical, chemical, and biological system. Okay, so we rely on the healthy ocean to satisfy the material conditions for example, the human rights to life, health, food, water, cultural rights as well, and of course the human right to a healthy and sustainable environment, as endorsed by the UN General Assembly. So we know that the ocean produces half the world's oxygen. It contributes to the renewal of fresh water. It provides food. It provides livelihoods. And it hosts rich and unique biodiversity, and it produces multiple different benefits for human health, many of which are unknown. And then in turn, the ocean plays this important role in regulating our global climate. So it absorbs 26% of global carbon dioxide emissions, and it stores 90% of the excess heat from global warming. And this important role in the ocean that the ocean plays in global climate regulation is understood in what we call the ocean climate nexus. Okay, and so to that end, the ocean should be sort of recognised as an essential element of the sort of intersection between climate change, human rights, and indeed law of the sea. So the full extent of the ocean's biodiversity is not well known. It's not fully understood, but I think there's sufficient knowledge that indicates the marine life and the overall health of the ocean is declining dramatically. We can see that. Although it's not irreversible. But in addition to that, we have very limited understanding of the sort of intrinsic social and cultural values of the ocean and the different kind of contributions it makes to human well-being. And I think there's probably other people that have discussed this today, so I won't spend too much time on this, but we know there's scientific consensus on the fact that climate change is altering the physical and the chemical makeup of the ocean. And this has been comprehensively outlined in the 2009 Intergovernmental Panel on Climate Change report and the special report on the ocean and cryosphere in a changing climate. And of course, the main impacts of climate change on the ocean are warming, acidification, deoxygenation, and so on. And these all simultaneously occur due to increasing carbon dioxide and other greenhouse gas emissions as well. So I'll leave those statistics up there for you to for you to look at. You've probably seen them before, but I think really just to focus on for the rest of the presentation, to focus on fisheries. This is what I wanted to do today. And it's really just that given we've outlined the impacts of climate change on the ocean, we know that then the impacts of climate change on marine living resources are very significant. Okay, we know that fish stocks are shifting to different regions as oceans warmed, either towards the poles or into deeper water. And habitats, of course, are being degraded as well via climate change and a range of other exploitation activities. So these changes affect fishers' ability to catch fish. It disrupts their primary source of food, their primary source of income. And things like extreme weather events as well, things like hurricanes and so on, they can destroy coastal fishing infrastructure. And now small-scale fishers, and I'll talk about them quite a bit in the presentation today, small-scale fishers are particularly vulnerable to the impacts of climate change. They often lack the resources or the technology to adapt to these changes in the way that larger vessels could do, for example, follow fish stocks to new locations and so on. Small-scale fishers often don't receive government subsidies in the way that industrial fishers do. And so without the means to adapt, these fishers they face a sort of growing struggle to maintain their livelihoods. Okay, so if fishers can no longer fish in an area due to stock shifting and they move into another area, then they cannot fully exercise their rights to secure access to fisheries and their rights to secure tenure in relation to fishing grounds at sea. Since small-scale fishers are dependent on this for their subsistence and their livelihoods, the right to fish and to secure marine tenure can be seen as a sort of precondition for the realisation of multiple different human rights. And so this includes the human rights explicitly recognised and affirmed by the UN Declaration on Human Rights, the ICCPR, the ICESCR. And which ones am I talking about here? Namely, the more obvious ones, mainly the rights to food, to work, and to culture as well. And the exercise of the right to fish can be really deeply rooted in the identity and in the life of certain fishers, such that fishing means not just catching fish, but it means customs, it means traditions, it means heritage, it means life to them. So consequently, being unable to exercise the right to fish due to a changing ocean can hinder the continuity of daily customary practices. That includes things like passing on fishing knowledge and experiences among different fishers and to members of the communities across different generations. And so this means that the full exercise of fishers' rights to participate in cultural life is also at risk. So the possibility to fish in different areas and to diversify catch in response to climate change really depends on fishers' technical and financial capabilities and know-how, whether they have the appropriate vessels, whether they have appropriate gears, tools, to adapt to different conditions. So small-scale fishers practicing hand fishing, for example, or using small-scale canoes or non-motorised fishing boats, they'd be limited with their fishing capacity and they may not be financially or even culturally sort of prepared to look for alternative livelihoods or a different occupation. This increases the challenges they already face, and in connection with this, sea level rise and extreme weather events put at risk the lives of fishers, whether at sea or while they're on the coast. So the environmental instabilities caused by climate change can, decrease the ability to fishers to fully exercise their rights to life, to the enjoyment of the highest sustainable standard of physical and mental health, and to an adequate standard of living. And then fishing in other areas, of course, might depend on authorisation, changes in existing fishing licences that communities might have, imposing sort of additional burdens then on fishers. So this sort of, in response to climate change then, the urgent search for fisheries resources might consequently lead to unsustainable fishing practices, for example, and it might put more pressure on the marine environment as competition increases for marine space. And fisheries resources among fishers themselves and between fisher and users undertaking other activities in the marine space. So there's an increased sort of conflict as well. So consequently, then different types of conflicts in fisheries and relating to fisheries might arise. Okay, alongside sort of irresponsible fishing, we have greater subjection to environmental disaster risks, and these issues are sort of closely linked. And affect fishers' full exercise of their right to a healthy, clean and sustainable environment, which in turn, can't be fully exercised in a changing ocean context. So just to hammer home the point and to reiterate, while all fishers can be impacted by climate change, scientists have found that small-scale fishers may be even more vulnerable to environmental change than their industrial counterparts. Now, at the same time, dealing with historical, multiple different challenges and unforeseen threats have kind of really built fishing communities' capacity to respond to changes and to adapt to changing environmental conditions. But such capacity is seen as a fundamental part of the culture and the ethos that's enabled their long-term persistence in the marine environment. But this might not be sufficient to keep pace with sort of changing biophysical stressors. Now, onto the law, okay. Now, UNCLOS contains very few provisions that are relevant really to the protection of fishers' rights. Okay, we've heard a little bit about this already, and that's not necessarily an issue. But in the changing ocean context, there are some things that are important. Okay, so the pertinence of UNCLOS in protecting fishers' rights is sort of twofold. Okay, so first of all, ensuring activities in marine waters and land-based activities affecting marine waters are carried out sustainably, or in a way that does not involve a kind of extreme pollution, and also by preventing or tackling climate change impacts in the ocean in the first place. Okay, so the law of the sea doesn't sufficiently address the kind of sustainable development and the environmental concerns that emerged after its negotiation. We all know this, but the treaty prescribes certain obligations that limit states parties' discretion in the manner that they can use and exploit ocean resources. Okay, it's not a free-for-all, as we know. So noteworthy examples are the provision on total allowable catch and the best scientific evidence for the conservation and management of living resources in the exclusive economic zone, and on interstate cooperation in the conservation and management of living resources on the high seas, or of course stocks that straddle 2 or more or 1 EEZs in the high seas as well. And then in addition to that, we're all familiar with Part 12, which of course contains general obligations to protect and preserve the marine environment, including their competence and power to enforce necessary measures in their respective territorial seas and internal waters to prevent, reduce and control marine pollution. Now, obviously, when we wrote this article, the advisory opinion hadn't been rendered yet, so I've had to edit my notes a little bit, but international legal scholarship, of course, supports the notion that obligations under Part 12 of the Law of the Sea include the duty to prevent the effects of climate change in the ocean. And this is a matter that the International Tribunal for the Law of the Sea has elucidated on, so thank you very much for that. But in the exercise of such duties, state parties to UNCLOS can take necessary measures to protect the marine environment through, say, establishment of marine protected areas, and in doing so, and also penalties for marine pollution, including plastic pollution. And in doing so, states protect everyone's right to a clean, healthy and sustainable environment by protecting the ocean, okay? It's quite a simple argument to make, I think. And that also, in doing so, that also helps realise a range of other fundamental rights to fishers that have been outlined in the previous slide. So the Law of the Seas Convention's evolved over time, okay? We know this. We've got kind of so-called implementing instruments or agreements, including the Fish Stocks Agreement and the BBNJ Agreement, which is relevant here. But it also contains, the Convention also contains provisions referring to generally recommended international standards, which kind of serve as the basis for international guidance and can aid interpretation and application of the fisheries provisions, at least of the Convention. And they elaborate on state parties' duties in that respect. Now, while the BBNJ agreement's not in force, it's worth examining both kind of agreement's contents to clarify, the provisions which parties to the Fish Stocks Agreement and future states parties to the BBNJ agreement are and will be bound by, and which can contribute to protection of fishers' rights in a changing ocean context. So starting with the Fish Stocks Agreement, its relevance for protection of fishers' rights is sort of indirect and reflected in kind of qualified language, okay? And that it requires parties to, and I quote, take into account the interests of artisanal and subsistence fishers as a principle for the conservation and management of straddling and highly migratory fish stocks. Now, the need to avoid the adverse impact on and ensure access to fisheries by those fishers, as well as women fish workers and Indigenous peoples, is also required for states parties when giving effect to their duty to cooperate in the conservation and management of the stocks concerned. Now, these provisions are as far as the Fish Stocks Agreement goes, enjoying states parties' attention to protect fishers, notably in kind of respect of vulnerable groups like small-scale fishers. So additionally, the Fish Stocks Agreement can be considered relevant due to both the precautionary approach, which is explicitly and widely adopted to protect living marine resources and to preserve the marine environment, and the contributions that conservation and management of stocks can bring to strengthening the resilience of the environment, its habitats, the ecosystems, and against the impacts of a changing ocean. And then for its part, the BBNJ agreement contains certain provisions relevant to the protection of fishers' rights concerning their knowledge and their culture. And it also provides for important considerations for climate change impacts on marine ecosystems. So, for example, in the preamble of the BBNJ agreement, it affirms the existing rights of Indigenous peoples pursuant to the UN Declaration on the Rights of Indigenous Peoples and of Local Communities, as well as the need to coherently and collaboratively address marine biodiversity loss and ecosystem degradation due to climate change impacts on marine ecosystems. Now, the BBNJ's agreement's principles and approaches include the precautionary and the ecosystem approaches, as well as an approach that builds ecosystem resilience, including the adverse effects of climate change and the use of, and I quote, relevant traditional knowledge of Indigenous peoples and local communities. Okay, how am I doing for time? Sorry. I'm fine. Okay,
yeah,
cool.
Yeah.
Right, okay, that's fine. So also what's important is the provisions on establishing area-based management tools as well in the high seas. So this includes marine protected areas, as well as the provisions on environmental impact assessment and strategic environmental assessment as well. And this is because they contribute to sort of strengthening the ocean's resilience to climate change and its capacity then to act as a carbon sink and absorb greenhouse gases. And now, while they're not in themselves human rights obligations, they do have direct consequences for the enjoyment of human rights, which has implications on states' obligations to protect said rights from interference, right? Although the specific human rights issues would not be addressed within the Law of the Sea's realm of compulsory jurisdiction, we've heard a little bit about this already, the protection of human rights affected by a changing ocean could be sought from international human rights monitoring mechanisms, for example, as I've explained a little bit below and we've elucidated in the previous presentation as well. Now on to the climate change regime. I'll try and be brief. So, UNFCCC doesn't contain any explicit mention of human rights, and neither does the Kyoto Protocol. And it took several years to bring human rights into the UN climate policy discussion. 10 minutes, okay, fine. And a lot of this, it took some time for climate change and human rights to really interact, but This was kind of largely prompted through the efforts of the Human Rights Council. Okay, so since 2008, it's raised awareness about the threats to climate change, and that it poses, the threats that climate change poses to peoples and communities and so on, and the need to connect climate change with human rights. So at the 16th meeting of the Conference of the Parties in 2010, the parties to the UNFCCC agreed that parties should, in all climate-related actions, fully respect human rights. Great. Okay. However, human rights were not mentioned in subsequent COPs until about COP21, and that was the Paris Agreement sort of preamble, which refers to the human rights to health, the rights of Indigenous peoples, local communities, migrants, children, persons with disability, and people in vulnerable situations. It also refers to the right to development, as well as gender equality, empowerment of women, and intergenerational equity as well. So human rights kind of references after the Paris Agreement sort of dissipated again from COP debates and subsequent COPs, and then kind of references in sort of very specific different contexts and COP decisions. So then we get to 2017, we get to COP23, and then we find reference to the human right to food as well, and a decision to adopt a gender action plan and to promote and consider human rights obligations in a broader context, as well as in gender equality. So then COP24 in 2018, we see another mention of human rights and concerning the kind of elaboration of parties' laws and measures concerning displacement due to climate change, okay? And then the latest implementation plan at COP27 in 2022, so that was in Dubai, or was that Sharm el-Sheikh, sorry. That reproduces text from previous decisions, okay, from COP25 to COP26, and it sort of recommends that states promote and consider their respective human rights obligations, explicitly including the human right to a clean, healthy, and sustainable environment. So we do see some progress within the climate change system. So I'm not going to reiterate a lot of stuff. There's a vast body of scholarship on human rights and climate change. There's lots of rights-based litigation that we've heard about already. But you can take insights from this literature in their account of sort of Indigenous peoples and local communities as they're affected by climate change, and the particularities that are sort of faced by fishers in a changing ocean context really kind of merit special attention. And we elucidate that a lot in the article, of course. And the references to human rights in the preamble of the Paris Agreement and then in these COP decisions subsequently, need to be read in conjunction with the references that we find in these later COP decisions to the ocean, biodiversity and ecosystems, and then in the instruments and obligations under the law of the sea as well. So the explicit mention of those terms is a recognition, I think, of the kind of ecosystem goods and services that marine ecosystems and their biodiversity provide, so including fisheries, the human rights of fishers, and it can be argued that the kind of obligations that the Paris Agreement lays out apply to the management and conservation of marine living resources, despite being very procedural in nature. So we'll talk a little bit about the obligations under the Paris Agreement. The agreement contains a kind of mix of voluntary and binding obligations to parties' contributions to achieving this global climate goal on mitigation, adaptation, and finance. But to focus on Article 7, this contains multiple provisions with the objective of realising the aim of increasing the ability of states parties to adapt to climate change and fostering climate resilience, okay? It's worth noting that Article 7.5, which reiterates that, and I quote, adaptation should follow a country-driven, gender-responsive and participatory and fully transparent approach. And that needs to consider vulnerable groups, communities and ecosystems, and that such adaptation should be based on and guided by the best available science, including traditional, indigenous and local knowledge systems. So this provision is really key in sort of the support of fishers' participatory rights in a changing ocean context, okay? So in addition to that, we've got special agencies of the United Nations, such as the Food and Agriculture Organization, or FAO. They're encouraged to support state parties and to implement the above actions, okay, taking into account Article 7.5. So in support of this endeavour, the FAO's kind of made quite major contributions to that, including a whole kind of chapter in the small-scale fisheries guidelines, which we'll talk about in a wee second, as well as various other kind of technical and guidance documents in an adaptation context. Now, so it remains to be seen whether there's going to be a climate change and fisheries instrument developed by the FAO, the Committee on Fisheries, but there is sort of appetite for that as well. I'll hurry up here because I've got kind of running out of time, so apologies for that. But we've seen the human rights effects of fishers by climate change, and scholars have drawn a sort of attention on the IPCC findings that climate change will have impacts on life, especially those for coastal communities and vulnerable communities. And in a way, the sort of insufficient developments on human rights and the climate change regime have sort of been counterbalanced by the special procedures of the Human Rights Council, okay? These have kind of advanced making these linkages and incorporating climate change into the human rights realm, okay? So the previous Special Rapporteur on Human Rights in a climate change context, Ian Fry, he, in his sort of inaugural report on the promotion and protection of human rights in the context of climate change, and a subsequent report on legal options to protect human rights and persons displaced across international borders due to climate change, he sort of reiterated those as well, and subsequent reports have also done that. So these are really important developments, I think, for interpreting, these obligations within a system that is mutually supportive by way of climate change obligations and human rights obligations. So then the Law of the Sea Convention, we've mentioned this already, this does little to kind of offer for protection of fishers, and that's okay, but to fill this gap, and understand states' obligations to protect fundamental rights in the changing oceans, you kind of need to rely on the core human rights treaties, okay, as well as the UNDRIP and the UNDROP, which affirm the fundamental rights of fishers and provide obligations and recommendations to states to comply and observe in the protection of such rights, okay. So states parties to those treaties are, of course, bound by those obligations. Not every state is a party, but as we've alluded to already. And states which voted in favour of the adoption of the UNDRIP and the UNDROP are then expected to take measures to protect fishers' rights affected by a changing ocean if we interpret them holistically. And then, although considered non-binding, both declarations and the small-scale fisheries guidelines are based on binding obligations, and as such, these formally non-binding instruments can arguably generate lawmaking effects. Interpreting the provisions of relevant binding instruments should be considered complementarity to international guidance that specifically addresses fishers and the details and the actions the state should make to protect fishers' rights. But looking into some examples of specific obligations, just quickly, which I think are particularly relevant to the changing context. So under both the ICCPR and the ICESCR, states parties have a duty to sort of undertake steps towards achieving the full realisation of the rights recognised under the convention, okay? So including by adoption of laws to give effect to such rights, thank you very much. And the Committee on Social, Economic and Cultural Rights as well, which functions as a sort of ICESCR's monitoring bodies, highlighted when exercising the appropriate measures to comply with that treaty, judicial remedies in respect of human rights may be one of those measures, okay? Well, just in terms of time as well, I won't talk too much about Daniel Billy et al., but that was also relevant here, and this, of course, was a groundbreaking decision. But what I will talk about is the Committee on the Rights of the Child. So I don't think we've heard very much about children's rights so far today. And that's recently adopted. The Committee on the Rights of the Child has adopted a general comment on children's rights in the environment with a special focus on climate change. And the Special Rapporteur procedures before the Human Rights Council can also contribute to sort of elucidate the protection of fishers' rights in a changing ocean context as well. So the reports of John Knox, for example, are really useful in kind of clarifying the relationship between human rights and the environment, including the marine environment. And then just on the point of right to food as well, Olivier de Schutter, the former UN Special Rapporteur, has also contributed to bringing human rights approaches to fisheries as well. And then just very, very quickly, just to reiterate the importance of the kind of voluntary guidelines for securing sustainable small-scale fisheries. The guidelines, they've been adopted by the FAO, and the guidelines also kind of provide recommendations for enhancing the recognition and sustainable development of an equitable treatment by states and non-state actors to small-scale fishers, okay? So it's based on the human rights-based approach. The guidelines kind of link obligations that state parties are bound under the nearly universally ratified kind of core human rights treaties. And they clarify recommendations that states and non-state actors should do to protect small-scale fisheries, okay? So they establish the urgency in combating climate change, that's there in black and white as well, through consultation with small-scale fishers, with special support available to vulnerable communities as well. So they call for integrated approaches to address climate change impacts on small-scale fishers, and such that disasters can kind of compromise livelihoods and impacts of climate change on sort of harvest and post-harvest activities as well. And you can find similar guidance in UNDROP as well, and UNDRIP too, although it doesn't make UNDRIP doesn't make specific provisions on climate change as well. So, one could argue, I think, that despite these legal instruments, there's still significant gaps. One could also argue that the primary challenge is that treaties like UNCLOS and Paris Agreement don't really address the rights of fishers. One could also argue that there's a lack of mechanism for enforcement and accountability when states fail to protect fishers' rights. And then further, you could also argue that there's limited integration between human rights obligations and environmental policies at the state level. And that means that fishers are often, especially small-scale fishers, are often left without effective legal resource when their livelihoods are disrupted by climate change. But that said, I think in the article, we kind of demonstrate there's actually a number of different avenues that fishers can pursue to ensure their rights are respected, protected, and upheld in the context of climate change. So yeah, in the article, I think just because I'm running out of time, in the article we suggest kind of several recommendations to address some of these challenges, okay? And first, there's a need to strengthen the integration of human rights and environmental treaties. That's quite straightforward, of course, it's rather obvious. And ensuring that climate action considers the rights of small-scale fishers as well. And then on to more specific points, states should kind of provide financial and technical support to help fishers adapt to a changing ocean context, and then traditional knowledge should be respected and integrated into decision-making processes. And then finally, we're hoping that the remaining 2 advisory opinions, including the Inter-American Court on Human Rights, especially that one, and the ICJ can play a role into kind of further clarifying the responsibility of states to protect fishers and other vulnerable groups from the impacts of climate change. So, of course, we talk about the fragmentation of international law all the time, but I think this really requires just interpreting and using treaties and principles and approaches and non-binding instruments and from different legal regimes in a very systemic and integrated and mutually supportive manner, okay? But in examining kind of the interaction between human rights, the law of the sea and climate change to protect fishers, I think that's been quite a good kind of case study for us. And yeah, I think this kind of participatory approach to decision making is really important, and the use of kind of other UN special procedures and rapporteurs and so on is really helpful in terms of kind of ensuring participatory decision making in climate adaptation and mitigation to do with fisheries. So just for time, I will conclude, but again, I think the kind of key point really is the slide on the middle. So the protection of the fundamental rights of fishers in a changing ocean can't be secured by one single legal regime. I think we've managed to demonstrate that today, but rather on the interpretation or the use of different regimes, but kind of not limited to law of the sea, climate change, and human rights in a mutually supportive manner. Biodiversity law is also very important here. And such an approach can be used as a way of kind of advancing the protection of fishers' rights adversely affected by a changing ocean. So that was a whirlwind overview, but the article's out there as well if you want to read it, and we elaborate on all these other points as well. So thank you very much.